Partnership for Sustainable Development Data, which is a network of over 280 partners from all around the world, working together to ensure that the data revolution is used to achieve the Sustainable Development Goals. I will be your host today for this discussion. This is the 27th webinar of a series continuing the conversation between the UN World Data Forums. The next forum will take place in Hangzhou, China, between the 23rd to the 27th of April 2022. Like the forum, the webinar series aims to share experience and open a dialogue between the global community of data producer and data users, whether they're part of governments, academia, civil society, private sector, and other institutions, in order to spur innovation, mobilize high-level political and financial support for data, and build a pathway to better data for sustainable development. I hope you can hear me, and I see that the slides disappeared, but I will continue, so please let me know if I should stop. So this webinar and topic of today is about the legislative rules for accessing privately held data, lessons learned and implications from the European Union Data Act for the global statistical community. Discussion around the use of privately held data for public policy and for development of and production of statistics have been around for over a decade. But in the past few years, thanks to COVID, we have realized the importance of relying on privately held data for especially emergency response. So this debate is really timely right now. And what we will do today is to take the opportunity and start from the Data Act that was recently published by the European Commission to discuss about what's going on in other parts of the world, if there is an appetite for this type of legislative solution for access to privately held data in other regions, and also to discuss what is the benefits for national statistical offices from these rules. So we have an amazing list of speakers for today, and I'm really excited to get us started. But before we do start, there are a few housekeeping notes that I need to share with you. First of all, we have live interpretation from English to Spanish and from Spanish to English today, which means that you have you have the opportunity to choose the language channel that you prefer. When you go on the bottom of your screen on Zoom, you have a small word icon, and then you can see that is called interpretation. And you can either decide to listen to this webinar in English, in Spanish, or in the language that is spoken by the speakers, which is meaning without interpretation. So we will have one Spanish intervention and the rest will be in English. The second thing that I would like to ask you to do is to introduce yourself. So let's find out who is in the room. I invite you to find the chat function, which is the small icon on the bottom of your screen that looks like a speech bubble. And you can type in 2 words, the country you're joining from and the sector you represent, National Statistical Office, private sector, international organization, or else. Please consider that we will use the chat function to communicate during the webinar. And you can also use the chat function to ask your question during this webinar. We already have received a large number of questions in advance that we have used to shape this conversation. However, we will take also a few questions from those that you will post right now during the conversation, so do not hesitate to do so. Now that the housekeeping is done, I'm very happy to introduce the first speaker, Maria Rosaria Cuduti. Maria Rosaria has been working as a policy and legal officer at the European Commission in the Data Policy and Innovation Unit since October 2018. She has played an active role in the definition of the data strategy of the European Commission and its implementation, and she was a member of the team that drafted both the Data Governance Act and the Data Act. Before joining the European Commission, Maria Rosaria worked in the field of international relations and foreign policy at the European External Action Service and at the Stockholm-based Institute for Security and Development Policy. She studied political science at the University of Bologna, where she graduated cum laude in international relations. She conducted 2 years of postgraduate research at the School of East Asian Studies, University of Sheffield. Maria Rosaria, we're very happy to have you as a panelist today and to kick us off. So the floor is yours.
Hi, everyone. Thank you very much, Martina. I'm glad to be here and talk about the Data Act. But first of all, let me zoom out for a moment to give you a bit introduction of our data policies. whose main objective is to make Europe a leading model globally for a data-empowered society and economy. The Data Act that we will discuss today is the second major legislative initiative announced in the data strategy of February 2020. And the data strategy combines a cross-sectoral legislative framework to foster sharing, access, and use of data, with the rollout of and funding of common European data spaces in various sectors of the economy and domains of public interest in order to build the single European market for data. Our vision, is based on 4 elements. Data can flow between sectors and countries. Ample of data is available for reuse and use. Data is used in full respect of European values, and clear rules on data access and use are in place. By implementing this strategy, we are modernizing the European legislative framework in light of digital advances to remove remaining and emerging barriers to the widespread use and reuse of data within and across member states and sectors to encourage digital innovation. And we also want that public sector body harness the potential of the data revolution. Whereas the Data Governance Act focused on increasing trust in the involuntary data sharing by regulating neutral, trusted data intermediaries, the Digital Markets Act targeted the market power of the gatekeeper platforms, and the Implementing Act on high-value datasets will unleash the socioeconomic potential of data as a raw material for innovation. The key objective of the Data Act is to ensure fairness in the allocation of data value among the various actors in the data economy. There is no value in data. Everyone would like to capture the whole value. If we don't sort out who gets the value, data will simply be less used, which is a problem. This is particularly the case of Internet of Things objects. All kinds of smart objects we have in our households or are used in industry, such as factory robots, harvesting machines, etc. Things used to be quite simple in the past, but how does that work for objects that generate data? Do the data belong to the manufacturer of the object, to the user, or even to a third party who has an interest in it? Things are simply not clear. The Data Act regulates economic rights on data, further empower consumers in the data economy, and it aims at clarifying who can use what data and under which conditions. Of course, the Data Act complements general data protection regulation by strengthening the right to data portability, by extending it also to non-personal data. The Data Act does not create exclusive rights on data. On the contrary, it aims at reducing the obstacles for different actors to access and use the data. What we do with the Data Act is create possibilities for the users of the connected objects, including both individuals, businesses, to get access to the data or to give it to a third party. At the same time, the manufacturers keep the possibility to use the data. The Data Act is also an SMEs instrument, and companies are prohibited from unilaterally imposing unfair contractual related clauses to data sharing on SMEs. On cloud services, the proposal will enable the switching between services addressing existing lock-in effects. And then there are the business to government provision that will facilitate the use of business data for public institutions in exceptional situations such as emergencies. The pandemic has shown the need for a governance framework to allow the public sector to access and use certain data from companies. This is about public sector bodies not getting the right data. It is also about companies getting multiple requests for the same data and the need for streamlined procedures. This confirms what Expert Group on Business to Government Data Sharing reported in 2020. With the Data Act, we harmonize at EU level business to government data sharing by providing rules on how requests for data should be made in this context. We define the conditions under which the mechanism can be activated. It is a limited and targeted mechanism for cases where the public sector cannot get data through normal means. For example, reporting obligations in law or buying or procuring the data on the market. So it is about exceptional needs. For emergencies, it is clear data has to be shared and for free. About the other situation, this is for cases where a public sector really needs the data for fulfilling a task in the public interest that has been explicitly provided in law. That is the first condition. The burden of proof is on the public sector body. Then there is a second condition that can be fulfilled in two ways. Either the public sector body has done everything to get the data by other means, and new reporting obligations introduced by law cannot be put in place on time, or getting the data will lead to a considerable reduction of the administrative burden on companies. Think about the Statistical Office, for example, sending out surveys. Public sector bodies will have to demonstrate that their requests for data to companies are justified and based on exceptional needs, as defined by the Data Act. Those requests will also have to respect several specific conditions to be admissible, notably regarding their proportionality and transparency. Member states should assign a competent authority responsible for business to government data sharing the task to handle disputes, because a company is not obliged to handle the request always if the company thinks that the public sector body is not asking the right request. The Data Act will make possible for streamlining of procedures to ensure less administrative burden for companies. In the statistical context, the replacement of questionnaires by the use of scanner data can alleviate the burden of reporting obligations for companies. And the lesson we learned by putting in place these provisions of data for public good is that we need to find a sustainable business model acceptable also to the private companies that share their data with public sector bodies and official statistical institutions. So according to the Data Act, will be entitled to request data to private companies when there is an exceptional need. Thank you very much. I think I've exhausted my time.
Thank you very much, Maria Rosario. I think it was a splendid introduction, and you clarified already so many things about the Data Act, about the exceptional need, but also about the conditions that need to be put in place. So I think we will have a lot of questions for you later on, but for the moment, we will move to our next speaker. Our next speaker is Rosica Zaimova. Oh, sorry, no, my mistake. Our next speaker is Federico Segui. Federico is the Deputy Director General of the National Statistical Office of Uruguay. He is also responsible for the implementation of the data warehouse, integrated system of statistical registers and surveys at the National Statistical Institution. He has more than 25 years of experience in official statistics. Federico has been a consultant for international organizations such as the World Bank, United Nations, Paris 21, OECD, and others, as an expert in official statistics based on administrative registers, data management, IT for statistics, quality of statistics, metadata, and microdata anonymization. He's also the author of several publications and paper on those topics. Finally, Federico is an elected member of international organizations and a member of working groups on data stewardship of government data, administrative registers, data quality, amongst others. I'm very, very happy to have Federico with us today as a panelist to share a bit his thoughts about the implication of the Data Act. So Federico will be speaking in Spanish. For the English-speaking colleagues that are joining this call, if you go to the interpretation button, which is on the bottom of your screen, you can switch to the English channel and you will get the translation, the interpretation. For those that can listen to Federico in Spanish, they can stay on this channel. Thank you very much, Federico. The floor is yours.
Gracias, Martina. Bueno, muy buenos días, buenas tardes, buenas noches para todos. Es un gusto para mí estar aquí en este importante webinar. Muchas gracias a UN World Data Forum por la invitación, también gracias a Martina. Voy a hablar en forma pausada para facilitar el trabajo del intérprete. Next slide, please. Para empezar, quisiera destacar un par de conceptos que, bueno, ya adelantó María Rosaria, que son importantes y son señalados en la ley de datos, uno más general y otro relativo a las oficinas nacionales de estadística. El primero, bueno, es esta frase, ¿verdad? Al facilitar el acceso y uso de datos, la ley de datos debería reducir las cargas tanto en el sector público como entre las empresas, principalmente como resultado de la reducción de los costos de transacción y en términos de aumento de la eficiencia. Y bueno, el segundo concepto que es bien importante y está más relacionado a las ONE, es la necesidad excepcional de acceder a los datos en poder del sector privado por parte del sector público, que no solo contempla las situaciones de emergencia, sino que también considera la compilación oportuna de estadísticas oficiales cuando los datos no están disponibles de otra manera o cuando la carga de los encuestados se ve reducida considerablemente. Y bueno, esto último es clave para las oficinas nacionales de estadística, para acceder a los datos bajo este paraguas del concepto de necesidad excepcional. Bien, los temas que voy a tratar en esta breve presentación son, bueno, lecciones aprendidas de la experiencia europea relevantes para las ONE, implicaciones de las experiencias de intercambio de datos en las oficinas de estadística, y bueno, y los beneficios para estas. Next, please. Bien, como para ilustrar las dificultades que tenemos actualmente en la ONE para acceder a datos en poder del sector privado, permítame comentarles alguna situación que se ha dado recientemente en cuanto a acceso a datos de movilidades celulares, ¿verdad? En el 2020, en el marco de la pandemia, surgió la necesidad, como en tantos otros países, de contar con información oportuna sobre la movilidad de las personas, para la toma de decisiones sobre políticas sanitarias. Es así que iniciamos acciones desde el INE para obtener datos de movilidad de celulares de los 3 operadores de telefonía celular que operan en el país, que son Claro, Telefónica, Movistar y la compañía estatal Antel, que bueno, tiene el 50% del mercado aproximadamente. Obtener los datos de Antel, la compañía estatal, fue relativamente sencillo. Claro, estábamos en medio de la pandemia y bueno, al ser una compañía estatal, esto evidentemente simplificó las cosas. En cambio, con las otras 2 compañías privadas no se pudo obtener los datos que necesitábamos. Mantuvimos varias reuniones con ellos, con los técnicos, o sea, llegamos a nivel de discusiones con los técnicos para revisar los requerimientos y bueno, que ellos pudieran evaluar factibilidad, tiempos, todo ese tipo de cosas. Bueno, también en todo este proceso contamos con el apoyo de GPSDD durante el último año. También nos facilitaron un consultor para desarrollar un mapeo de los procesos. Bueno, fue un trabajo arduo de más de 1 año y medio, y bueno, no logramos obtener todavía los datos, salvo los datos que proporcionó la compañía estatal, Antel, que nos sirvió para hacer ¿verdad? Una primera experiencia con esos datos, de generar estadísticas a partir de este tipo, de estas nuevas fuentes de información, ¿no? Al menos nuevas para nosotros. Entonces, bueno, ahí cambiamos la estrategia, fuimos a través de la entidad reguladora de las comunicaciones en el país, y bueno, también llevó un tiempo convencerlos de la importancia de estos datos para el país, y para ellos en particular, sobre todo por el tema de la infraestructura crítica, ¿verdad? Y bueno, estamos en ese proceso trabajando, pero bueno, ha sido bastante tedioso, y bueno, por otro lado comentar que la ley estadística de Uruguay data de 1994, evidentemente es necesario actualizarla para, bueno, adecuarla a las necesidades actuales. En aquel momento no se hablaba de registros administrativos con fines estadísticos, al menos no explícitamente, y bueno, mucho menos de datos en poder del sector privado. De todas maneras, esa ley no nos limita el acceso a este tipo de datos, y bueno, por eso es que estamos transitando estos caminos que mencionaba anteriormente con el caso de datos de movilidad de celulares. Pero creo que si tuviésemos una ley de similares características a esta ley de datos de la Unión Europea, seguramente sería mucho más fácil, al menos incorporar ciertos aspectos de esta ley a la ley del Sistema Estadístico Nacional. Claro que no es lo único, es una condición necesaria pero no suficiente. Estas leyes deben ser acompañadas de otras iniciativas, pensar en proyectos colaborativos, incentivos de diferente índole para distintos sectores, y bueno, de nuevo, el concepto de necesidad excepcional es fundamental aquí para facilitar el acceso a los datos, este tipo de datos de parte de las ONE. Next, please. Bien, veamos las implicaciones para las ONE. Bueno, pedir datos una sola vez, bueno, al menos para el sector, o sea, en realidad esto es en beneficio de las empresas privadas, ¿verdad?, que mantienen los datos, pedirle los datos una sola vez de parte del sector público, y bueno, y después que se compartan dentro del sector público, acceso directo, ¿verdad?, solicitudes de datos al sector privado, y en forma indirecta a través del intercambio de datos secundarios en el sector público, ¿verdad? Estas serían como las implicaciones para las ONE, ¿no? Y bueno, habría que pensar de pasar de incentivos y la compra de datos a compensaciones, ¿verdad? En el caso del INE de Uruguay no estábamos manejando la posibilidad de comprar datos, sino más bien ir por el lado de incentivos, de brindar algún tipo de información que genera el INE a estas compañías, que también pueda servir en este proceso de intercambio de información, este proyecto colaborativo, ¿verdad? Next, please. En cuanto a los beneficios para las ONE, claramente esto permite asegurar y regular el acceso a los datos en poder del sector privado. En algunos casos estos datos bueno, no tendrían costo para la ONE cuando estos ya han sido obtenidos por alguna entidad pública y deben ser compartidos con la Oficina de Estadística. Bueno, en otros casos se prevé una compensación que incluye costos de generar información, más algún tipo de ganancia o, bueno, compensación razonable. Y bueno, creo que no tengo mucho tiempo. Next, please. Como comentarios finales, podemos mencionar que la ley de datos tendrá un gran impacto en las discusiones globales y locales. Bueno, la prueba está en la cantidad de participantes que tenemos en este webinar. Y bueno, es necesaria una amplia discusión, involucrar actores clave. Es una ley que abarca no solo, obviamente, a los INE, sino a todos los sectores. En el caso de Uruguay creemos que es importante trabajar con la Agencia de Gobierno Electrónico, AGESIC, donde también está bajo la órbita de esta agencia la Unidad Reguladora y Control de Datos Personales. Es un tema bien importante, y bueno, no tenemos tiempo tampoco para desarrollar, pero es un tema clave en todo esto. Y bueno, considerar todo esto en la Estrategia Nacional de Datos, y bueno, obviamente una discusión con los integrantes del Sistema Estadístico Nacional. Muchas gracias.
Thank you very, very much, Federico. It was incredible, as always, to have you and presenting your experience with Uruguay and what you tried to do with the MNOs. Very, very helpful. I think we will have questions for you as well in a few minutes, but we now move to Rosica, who is our next speaker. Rosica Zaimova, she's a partner and co-founder at Dalberg Data Insights, and which is the big data entity of the Dalberg Group. Rosica is based in Kampala, Uganda, and in the past 6 years, she has managed the design and development of data ecosystem and data-driven products in sub-Saharan Africa, with a focus on energy, public health, gender, youth, employment, agriculture, and poverty. On a day-to-day basis, she manages a complex ecosystem of data providers, data users, regulators, and funders, and she has been advising digital and data strategies with governments and development partners that set the foundation for the digital transformation in SSA. Rosica has a Bachelor of Economics from the American University in Bulgaria and a Master of Science in International Management from ESA, the Business School in Spain. She's an Acumen East African Fellow and was recently named one of the Forbes 30 Under 30 Social Entrepreneurs in Europe. Rosica, thank you very much for being with us today, and the floor is yours.
Great, thank you, Martina, and good afternoon, everyone. Great to virtually connect with so many people from all over the world. I think it's timely actually to come right after Federico, as I carry the private sector hat, and I'm going to speak in the next few minutes on behalf of my organization, Dalberg Data Insights, and particularly focus on more the practical takeaways and learnings from over 7 years of experience facilitating public-private partnerships. And of course, touch upon how the Data Act could enable such partnerships at a larger scale, but also what are the needed things in place beyond just the legislation to be able to do those partnerships at scale. Can we go to the next slide, please? And before I start, just briefly about my organization, we are part of a global group that is working towards building a more sustainable and inclusive world where everyone can reach their fullest potential. We're about 700 of us in 24 locations all over the world. Next one, please. And we encompass a wide variety of expertise, not only data analytics, but strategy consulting, design and implementation, research, catalysts, etc., building initiatives. And here I'm representing Dalberg Data Insights, an organization that has been working actually with the private and the public sector over the last 7-8 years, enabling such data public-private partnerships. Can we go to the next slide? So basically, we have been working not only in sub-Saharan Africa, but actually Africa overall, in Asia and in Latin America, with some of the largest telecom operators facilitating the basically data access, so that the data that we encourage everyone to see as an asset can be used to advance the sustainable development goals. And in that case, it's quite important to actually look at both the supply of data, but also the demand of data, and be able to bridge that gap. As Federico mentioned, during the pandemic, actually, we saw the acceleration of, actually the need to unlock private sector data. However, even when the legislations were there, we missed some of the technical infrastructures in place, and actually missed to actually grasp the incentives of the private sector to share such data. And if I need to bring a concrete example from my experience, in Belgium, my organization worked with the 3 telecom operators in Belgium, so Proximus, Orange, and Telenet, where within 2 weeks, we managed to get access to the CDR's data, which pre-pandemic times, that would have taken probably 6 months or 1 year, or even a little bit more. At that point of time, the Data Act was not enacted, obviously, but what really helped was actually having the operators fully come in, having the right technical infrastructure to be able to share that data smoothly. And the other aspect that really helped actually was having the Ministry of Digital at that point of time, and today the Prime Minister of Belgium, Alexander De Croo, literally had that initiative and require the telecom operators to come quickly on board. I believe with the Data Act today, that will happen even faster, right? But we have seen challenges happening, that being enabled before the pandemic, that access to the data, and now, the challenges remain. So I do think that such an act will facilitate that exchange, but it will not be sufficient because we need a lot more than that. And in the next few minutes, let me share some of the takeaways that I think will be essential for such a exchange to happen. Can we go to the next slide, please? So basically, throughout our works, we really encourage organizations, public and private, as well as the individuals, to see the data as an asset. The data has been increasing in volume. The data has become an essential output or byproduct of digital. And as such, we need to look at it as an asset, right? And that means that when we facilitate such public-private data exchanges, we really need to start not only from the data, but rather from the use cases. The data literacy is key, fostering a data community. The legislations are really essential. But if organizations, public and private, and the individual do not fully understand what their rights are, how they can control, how they can leverage data, then I think the data asset is fully under-leveraged. And finally, the trust. The data governance is really, really key for basically ensuring that that data exchange can happen with the consent of the individual, right? And that we've seen the more the individual trusts their governments, I think the smoother such data exchanges will be. Can we go to the next slide, please? And this is just a quick representation of kind of one perspective of how we can look at the data market in a sense. Because here, I think that the EU, in many of the documents we've seen, they refer to data spaces. It can be also data market. And when we talk about an asset, we inevitably talk about the data market. When we have consumers, us individuals, we have governments, we have businesses, we have a lot of sub-markets that are creating there. Sub-markets such as B2C or C2B. Think about the big tech and us using the technologies. Think about the B2B market of data that can actually be facilitated by such an app. And then we talk about here the government and consumer, or government and business, that is as essential, but also the other way around. And I feel the sub-markets that we're looking at here could further be granularized. If we add other components such as geography, if we add sector-specific data, etc., etc. And here, my key message is that the carrot and stick, so regulations versus incentives, will apply differently. Depends on what type of market we are looking at, what is the context and the geography, etc. And some, in some cases, we will need. Certainly, regulations, I think, are always important, but then the incentives might vary depending on the market we are looking at. Can we go to the next slide, please? Second, and very important, is we need to start investing more in data literacy for both the public, the private sector, and the individuals. The Data Act will be essential to unlock the power of the data, but I think we all agree that society empowered by data is only when the society is data literate. I actually just copied a quote from the Data Act proposal that states new rules are allowing customers to effectively switch between different cloud data processing services providers and put in place safeguards against unlawful data transfer. All of us here work in data, but how many of us actually fully understand this phrase? And how many of us are able to switch different cloud data processing services when we work with different providers? I mean, I know you probably get the point here, but we need to start investing in data literacy, both for the individual, if we talk about data sovereignty and control of the data, but also for the organizations themselves. Maybe for Federico, it was a bit harder to get access to the data, not only because the legislations were not there, but also there were no technical infrastructures probably to be able to facilitate secure access to data in a very efficient way. And if we have that in place, if we have a community, both within the public and private sector, that are completely data literate on that aspect, and individuals that are empowered by data knowledge, I think we are going to talk about a data market that is flourishing. Can we go to the last slide, please? I believe. And finally, as I mentioned before, I think the transparency and trust will be as important as the regulations themselves. And those in certain geographies even more than others. I think we've seen during the pandemic how certain governments were more prepared just because they used data, let's say, more effectively. but that doesn't necessarily mean that the citizens really trusted how the governments will use that data. And I think for such a data market to flourish, we need to ensure that that trust and transparency is there. Just consider, for example, and GDPR and obviously the Data Act puts the individual in the center, right? Enabling the individual to fully leverage and control the data that we create. But how many of us actually fully understand how our data is being used? In the most, typical option is, obviously we have an opt-out option, but the default is always opt-in when it comes to data sharing. And many of us don't even know where we share data for. And I believe for a thriving data marketplace or data spaces, as the EU calls them, to thrive and to flourish, we need to make sure that we create the right transparency mechanisms for both individuals, companies, governments, to basically ensure the trust of the individual. And I think that's it for me. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Rosita. That was very interesting, and we're lucky to have a private sector perspective also today during this webinar to get the full picture of this topic. We now have our last but not least panelist, Dr. Pierre Desrochers. Pierre Desrochers is the Director and Chief Privacy Officer at Statistics Canada. He provides leadership on programs, projects, services, and administrative policies in information and data. Prior to this position, he held various positions and functions within the Privy Council Office, Indigenous Service Canada, Public Service and Procurement Canada, and Library and Archives Canada. He holds a PhD from the University of Montreal in Applied Human Science within the interdisciplinary field of information science and public administration. Dr. Desrochers was appointed in 2019 as Canada School of Public Service Digital Academy Fellow in Artificial Intelligence and Data Science. He's a frequent lecturer at the École nationale d'administration publique and an adjunct professor at the School of Information Study at the University of Ottawa. He has recently published a book on administrative data in the digital era at the Presse de l'Université du Québec. Dr. Desrochers, we're very happy to have you, and please, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much. First off, I'm grateful to be gathering with you from Ottawa on the unceded territory of the Algonquin Anishinaabe First Nation. We're the first people to walk the lands on which Canada's national capital is located today. My thanks also to the invitation to the UN World Data Forum webinar to discuss legislative rules for accessing privately held data. My comments and lessons learned are centered on the Canadian experience from a practical experience and founded in public administration considerations. I have a few remarks, opening remarks, and then I want to give us also time to have Q's and A's. We can all agree that the privately held data is a future source of data for national statistical offices. Its use by some may be limited by existing local legislative frameworks and trade agreements that try to address various data issues such as transport or data flows and accessing privately held data. European rules such as the Data Governance Act and the Data Act represents a unique solution to a localized problem. Striking a balance between the use of data in the public interest and the privacy rights of the individual can be difficult, and it requires complex public policy evaluations for NSOs. The Government Canada and its National Statistical Organization, Statistics Canada, has in place broad powers to collect privately held data that removes many of the legal barriers, doesn't stifle innovation, and equally important, doesn't represent an administrative burden for data providers. However, it needs to be variated by concerns for acceptability, both social and organizational, and emerging issues of public policy by decision makers. This is very similar to what Rosita just presented to us on trust and transparency. Furthermore, at Statistics Canada, we have various processes and frameworks established to ensure complete oversight of the data in our control and the collection of alternative data, such as privately held data. For example, we apply a necessity and proportionality ethical framework at the time of collection, use, and disclosure of the data. We also borrowed for the 5 Says framework from the UK for the protection and ensuring confidentiality of our data. We also have a quality assurance framework, a privacy framework, of which I'm the Chief Privacy Officer, and recently created a framework for responsible machine learning. These frameworks support our commitment for responsible data stewardship. To demonstrate our commitment to Canadians that we should respect their data, we ensure that we are transparent on the collection, use, and disclosure of the data. We created a trust center on our public-facing website where we tell Canadians what we are doing. For example, on the Trust Center, we acquire data such as how Statistics Canada acquires and uses telephone numbers under the authority of the Statistics Act to ensure that all Canadian households, including those that use cell phones exclusively, are contacted and represented so that our surveys can produce an accurate picture that reflects all the people of Canada. And we have done this since 1989. In 2017, we modified the Statistics Act, our home statute, to ensure the independence of the chief statistician and ensuring that data is managed using professional standards. We have adopted the principle of responsible privacy, which is meant to honor our commitment to privacy of Canadians through these actions. These processes or actions help guide our agencies to use the data, including privately held data, in a responsible manner. Just to conclude, like I said, I had a few remarks. At Statistics Canada, the pandemic not only accelerated the many enhancements that we had initiated over the last 5 years to our programs, spurred by the need to collect more data in alternative ways, such as privately held data. For example, we managed to improve the quality and coverage of inflation estimates through our consumer price index by collecting grocery prices through point of sales data. We also adopted to the new realities Canadians face in the pandemic by providing more granular estimates of income consumption, savings, and wealth amongst different household types. We're now using these data to show how pandemic support measures have impacted specific groups. And in partnerships with provinces and municipalities, the Canadian Housing Statistics Program offers a richer understanding of the factors driving housing markets, provides detailed information on the social economic characteristics of new home buyers and homeowners, including the financial characteristics. None of this information could have been produced without access to individual citizens. Again, happy to have conversation and to engage in the question period with our colleagues. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Dr. Desrochers, and it's very refreshing to hear what's going on in Canada as well, and all these great initiatives that you just mentioned. So what will happen for the next, let's say, around 20 minutes, we took some of the questions that you participants have asked during your registration, and we're going to turn them to the speakers. But in the meantime, while we do that, I encourage you to post questions in the chat, because we will have a few minutes afterwards to also ask any original question that can be found in the chat during this conversation. The first question that we would like to ask to our panelists is actually a question for Maria Rosaria and maybe Federico as well, if he wants to give it a stab. And the question is, what drove the EU regulators to establish the rules included in the Data Act for access to privately held data? And what could drive other regulators to do the same and follow a similar approach? Maria Rosaria, please go ahead. And then Federico, you let me know if you want to take it as well.
Thank you very much, Martina. So the overall problem that we try to address, not only with the Data Act, but with the entire data strategy, is the insufficient availability of data for use within the European economy. This is mainly due to lack of clarity on data rights, imbalances in negotiating power, limited access to fair and trustworthy cloud services, and lack of cross-sector data interoperability in the European Union. So we have been working on this for quite some time, even some years before the publication of the data strategy. Because from talking with many and different stakeholders across the union and conducting several online consultation and procuring several studies, to really see what's going on out there in all the contexts, from business to business, business to government, business to consumer. So we did a very deep collection of evidence that brought up that consumers and companies have limited ability to realize the value of data generated by their use of products, that there are low levels of data availability for creating added value in business to business relations, that there are inefficient practices for use of private sector data by public sector, creating most of the time burden for companies. There are barriers to switching of cloud and edge services, and risks of unlawful third country access to data. So from these problems, then we observed several consequences, like there is limited competition, slower data innovation, there are less consumer choice and higher prices for data products and services, loss of European competitiveness in the global data economy, low quality public service delivery and market fragmentation, and lack of necessary and adequate computing resources for data sharing. These are the specific consequences that we tried to address with the Data Act. And whilst the Data Governance Act was more about creating trust, as my colleague was, Rosita was saying just before, with the Data Governance Act, we created the framework, a trustworthy framework and conditions for everyone that wants to share the data to do it in safe and trusted way. And with the Data Act, we try to clarify exactly who can do what with which data. So the ultimate goal is to increase trust in data sharing, access and use, to make more data at the service of the economy, of the society, and really try to harness this huge amount of also industrial data that is created in Europe. And let's just keep in mind that the Data Act is an internal market instrument. So we always have to find the right balance between the interest of all the stakeholders involved, the private sector stakeholders, the public sector stakeholders, the citizens. Of course, we want to empower them to have control on the data, on their personal data, but also the data that they contribute to produce by using the smart object. So these are, and you know, we go to legislation when we have enough evidence that the guidelines, the principles that are already are there, and also the Commission published already some guidance for sharing private sector data back in 2018, but then they didn't really work. So that's why then we worked on this proposal, this legislative proposal that we don't really see as a stick. But it's a way to make sure that more data is used in trusted way, respectful of the interest of all the stakeholders.
Thank you very much, Maria Rosaria. And I understand that you don't see it as a stick, and this terminology has been used quite a lot. Federica, I'm not sure if you want to take it, but I would be curious to hear, based on the experience you had with the mobile network operators in recent times, if you think that down the road that there might be something that would drive your colleagues in the Uruguay government to go in the same direction, or if you think this is something that is really not on the table and will not be at all.
Sí, yo espero que sí, que se empiece la discusión. Esto es bastante reciente. Espero que esto, digamos, al menos motive la discusión a nivel de las agencias del gobierno en Uruguay, para ir en esta dirección. Y bueno, como decía, esto es reciente, pero ya hemos empezado a conversar sobre el tema, y en particular sobre, bueno, lo que mencionaba durante la presentación, la experiencia de intentar acceder a los datos de movilidad de celulares, que lo hemos logrado en forma parcial y queremos seguir avanzando en ese sentido. Eso también, bueno, nos motiva, digamos, a trabajar en esta línea, y como decía también durante la presentación, no alcanza solamente con el marco legal, ¿verdad? O con actualizar, aunque sea actualizar nuestra ley estadística, sino también complementarlo con otro tipo de acciones. Pero yo creo que sí, que es bien importante, como lo fue la ley de protección de datos personales, que bueno, luego fue un modelo que se tomó aquí en Uruguay. Creo que esta ley de datos también puede servir, digamos, como modelo o para tomar parte de ella y obviamente adaptarla al contexto nacional.
Thank you very much, Federico. That's really interesting to hear. I think I have now a question for Rosita and then a question for Pierre, and then we will go back to Maria Rosaria and Federico. So first, the question for Rosita. You mentioned this question of stick and carrot in a sense when speaking about legislation being one of the possible approaches. And you also mentioned that there are different markets that might need different types of incentives in terms of carrot or stick, although this question of stick was raised that Maria Rosaria legislation is not necessarily always a stick, but just wanted to let you elaborate, if you wish, on where do you think other incentives might lie, and what are the difference between the different markets, and where more carrots or more sticks might be needed.
Yeah, thanks, Martina. It's a great question, actually. And I think we need both. And in some instances, regulation is more needed than incentives, but incentives are also very key in practice, right? To make it more concrete, I think in the B2C market or C2B, consumer to business, think of all the tech sector, we need proper regulations there. And I think we all would agree with that, right? If you let the tech sector does whatever they want without regulations, I don't think we want to live in that world, right? So we need regulations and maybe less incentives. But if you talk about the government to business, business to government, also government to government, I think actually the incentives there become really important. And I think Maria Rosaria did mention, that the free access to data. You also mentioned sustainable business models. I actually think, private sector is there to make money in the first place. And I've worked with the telcos for the last 7 years. And I tell you that for them to share efficiently access to the data, they need to actually have someone full-time almost working on that. They need to invest in infrastructure. That actually costs money. So how they do that if they don't have the incentive, not only the regulation, right? And in that case, even financial incentives. So it's a sustainable business model for them, even if it's not about making a lot of money, but about at least covering the costs. So I do think that it's a fine line and a good balance between incentives and regulations. But I believe all of us agree that regulations are very key for all these sub-markets that I mentioned before.
Thank you very much, Rosita. That's very helpful already. And then going back to Pierre, I think Pierre, with the experience that you bring in terms of from a privacy perspective, my question for you will be in terms of the challenges that access to privately held data raise in terms of privacy and data protection. And if you have experience in Canada on how you dealt with some of these challenges, or if you want to share your consideration around that, that would be awesome.
Appreciate it. In fact, Federico and Rosita really articulated when, especially Federico, in terms of the issues that he's currently having in his country. There are localized problems. Privacy frameworks across the world, when talking with the Data Act, interplay differently depending on the jurisdiction that we're working in. In Canada, we have a complex different environment for privacy depending on my provinces, municipalities, as well as the federal government. And there are various ways that we're working with both my Department of Justice and the Department of Innovation, Science and Economic Development to update some of our privacy legislation, to ensure also that the national statistical organizations are represented in that environment. I think that's very important because I see this as an interplay between two dimensions. As Rosita mentioned, there's a component here of organizations, corporations that are working with their own understanding of how privacy works, confidentiality and whatnot. And there's an individual's perspective on how privacy works. And again, also the interplay there of that individual's rights of consent to that information. For national statistical organizations, our legislation, which predates the Second World War, gotta let that sink in for everyone, 1918, updated in 1971, last major revision in 1971, and again, slightly amended in 2017, touches on some of this, but again, before most of our privacy frameworks even came to play in Canada. So for me, in terms of the experience that we have, it's mostly one of social acceptability. I'll let that repeat, which goes back again to that trust and transparency. We have to be out there with our decision makers, our policy makers, our decision makers, Canadians, explaining what we're doing, how we're doing it, how decisions are made, how, and I see the chat, how suppressions of certain data elements are maintained. And again, maintaining that within a professional context. And that's a complex role to play, and changing both the perceptions of the people working in that domain, but also more importantly, how we're using that data going further. My last comment to this is that social acceptability is in two components. It's both an organizational one and also one with individuals or policymakers. The organization also has to adapt its methods and procedures. And this has been literally my discussion over the last maybe 15, 20 minutes, has been how organizations, national statistical organizations, also need to adapt their administrative procedures, their administrative policies, rather than just focusing specifically on their legislative frameworks and how that needs to adapt. And I'll stop there.
That is really helpful, Dr. Desrochers, and I think you can stay with the video on, because I have a question for you and Federico linked to what both you have said before going back to Maria Rosaria and Rosita. And my question is actually, you both mentioned the Statistical Acts, and now this Data Act is something that is entirely separate from Statistical Acts. But my question is around whether do you think it makes sense to have a separate legislation and go a separate way for regulating access to privately held data, if that's a solution, or whether the update of the Statistical Acts can already help addressing some of the challenges that you both mentioned and some of the localized problems you also mentioned, Dr. Desrochers. So maybe if you want to start, Dr. Desrochers, since you're on the video, and then we have Federico jumping in afterwards.
That's a very good question. In fact, we updated the Statistics Act in 2007 very slightly to clarify both the independence of the chief statistician, but also the process of how we acquire privately held data. There's a request for information process, which we give to the minister, providing him a viewpoint in terms of what we're acquiring from a very high level. We're transparent to Canadians and to the organizations by publishing this on our website. But prior to that, we engage with the organizations throughout time so that we can ensure that by the time we get to the RFI and finalize the process, we've applied a multiplicity of administrative tools internally, the necessity and proportionality frameworks, so to make sure that we're not asking too much data from the privately held data or from the organization. And we've looked at other sources of alternative data. Is it administrative data that another organization within government collects? At which point, why am I collecting it again a second time from an organization? Again, that question of responsive burden and reduction of administrative burden overall. My perspective on this, and we've had multiple conversations internally at Statistics Canada, is that the interplay between multiple different legislations cannot forget the National Statistical Organization. And what I mean by cannot forget is that it is, in our case in Canada, a constitutional requirement. So when we come back to organizations looking at other pieces of legislation, we have to make sure that it is not enfreiné. It does not touch and reduce the intent that policymakers had when they drafted the Statistics Act back in World War I. And that is fundamental for us, because this is like la raison d'être of the organization, to support and inform decisions for policymakers and writ large benefits of Canadians. I hope I answered the question.
You certainly did, and thank you very much again for sharing your insights on this. Federico, do you want to jump in before I go back to Rosita and Maria Rosaria with a question for them, and then we do a final round?
Sorry.
Federico, do you think you want to weigh in on whether the Data Act as a separate horizontal legislation would be complementary or replacing, or how do you see the relation with the update of the Statistical Act? You also mentioned that Uruguay has a Statistical Act that is from 1994, if I remember correctly. Yes. So do you think these are like the urgent thing to do is the update of the Statistical Acts, and some of the rules that we're discussing today should go in there, or a separate act as the Data Act could also be helpful according to your perspective?
Sí, yo creo que por un lado es necesario actualizar nuestra ley estadística, por un lado para acceder a regular, digamos, determinar el acceso a registros administrativos del sector público, pero también incorporar datos en propiedad, en poder del sector privado. Y si esto debe estar separado, digamos, de una ley de datos, bueno, evidentemente la ley de datos es más abarcativa, entonces evidentemente esa es una discusión que se debe dar, como lo mencionaba en la presentación, ¿verdad? Con los actores relevantes, la Unidad Reguladora de Protección de Datos Personales, la Agencia de Gobierno Electrónico, el sector público en general y obviamente incluir al sector privado en esta discusión. Y bueno, tal vez son dos caminos en paralelo, pero bueno, ver cuáles son los puntos en común. Creo que estamos en ese proceso de esa discusión inicial.
Thank you very much, Federico. That's helpful as always. I have a question for Rosita and Maria Rosaria. Maybe Maria Rosaria goes first and then Rosita jumps in. So the question is, Maria Rosaria already mentioned it, there are rules for the use of this privately held data that is accessed by the public sector under the Data Act. But the question is more generally, how can we make sure that governments use the data they have accessed in an ethical way and for the specific purpose that was initially thought? So under the Data Act, I understand this is really regulated and that there are some specific provision on that. So Maria Rosaria, if you want to elaborate on that, and then Rosita can jump in.
Sure. Thank you very much. No, indeed, but I want to make sure that everyone, it's clear to everyone here that the B2G provision in the Data Act are really limited to specific exceptional need. So our focus is not even on the purpose, is not on the kind of data, is not that's why we don't limit the B2G to any specific sector or use cases, because what triggers the B2G provisions is the exceptional need to use the data that is defined in Article 15 and that I briefly mentioned in the introduction. Then the request from the public sector body to the private sector company has to respect some very well defined criteria in the Data Act in Article 17. So the public sector body or the union institution, agency or body shall specify exactly data that are required and has to demonstrate the exceptional need for which the data are requested. So the burden of proof is on the public sector body. Has to explain the purpose of the request, the intended use of the data requested, the duration of the data use, to state the legal basis for requesting the data, and also specify the deadline by which the data are to be made available or within which the data holder may request the public sector body to withdraw the request. Then the data has to be destroyed when the purpose of the request has been fulfilled. So we think that, by providing these harmonized, proportionate, transparent mechanisms for business to government data sharing for exceptional needs, we provide the kind of safeguards to the private sector entities to make sure that they can also trust that their data will not be misused. And then all the requests would have to be made available, not the data, but the request. There is the one solid principle that also applies in case of emergencies to make sure that a company is not bothered by lots of requests for the same data set from different public sector bodies. So we tried to make the system, the mechanisms, as much as clear and trustworthy as possible, and to make sure that any public sector data misuse the data. And then we also operate by assuming that public sector bodies in the European Union, by default, they work for the public interest, for the benefit of the citizens of the society. So they respect the European values. So we hope that that we provide enough guarantees to make to private companies to make sure that the data is not misused.
Thank you very much, Maria Rosaria. Rosita, you want to weigh in?
Yeah, and I think that's an important clarification, right? That these are kind of in extreme circumstances. I think the question is, how do we define extreme circumstances? And I think here we can get very philosophical about it, right? And I think one practical maybe solution, and this is something that we've tried during the pandemic when we worked with the 3 telcos in Belgium to be able to work with the Ministry of Health and Ministry of Digital to provide them with insights, is actually setting up an ethics committee. And that ethics committee is actually sometimes consisting of philosophers, right? People that can kind of philosophize on what is ethical or right use of data. And that kind of, you know, I would say enabled a bit the trust that we had to build up this so quickly. And that data ethics committee is completely independent when it comes to kind of the incentives of the parties involved. And that was quite interesting, right? But I think the other very practical thing that we can be maybe thinking about putting in place when we talk about transparency is great that certain data sets have been accessed to fight the pandemic or to, you know, provide social benefits to people that suffered from landslides. But do these people whose data is being used know that their data has been used? Maybe just a quick, you know, notification, push notification that their data was used for such and such purposes would, you know, kind of trigger that transparency mechanism and allow for more trust in the future. So yeah, these are just a couple of very practical examples and thoughts. One has been tested, which is the data ethics committee. On the push notifications, not yet, but I think, you know, that's what we as citizens or people that work in the data space would like to see more of.
Thank you very much, Rosita. And I invite Pierre and Federico to turn their camera on because we're getting towards the end, but I would like to give you all the chance to say a few words for a few concluding remarks. We got a few questions in the chat around the role of the UN in establishing a global framework or some guidelines to help with this question of access to privately held data. So I think this is something you can, if you want, you can comment on, as well as any other comment you might have or takeaways from this webinar. And then after we'll start. Let's start with maybe Federico, then Pierre, Maria Rosaria, and Rosita as an order of speaking, and then I will say a few words to conclude. But it was very rich. So thank you very much, Federico. You can start, and then Pierre.
Gracias, Martina. Este webinar ha sido excelente para, bueno, intercambiar ideas, diferentes puntos de vista de, bueno, diferentes países, de diferentes regiones, y bueno, también obviamente del sector público y privado, y bueno, esta iniciativa, digamos, esta ley de datos de la Unión Europea, digamos, al menos aquí en Uruguay y en la región, abre toda una discusión, ¿verdad? Y que es bien importante, que bueno, hasta ahora la veníamos manteniendo, digamos, a partir de distintas experiencias como la que les comenté, digamos, de acceder a datos de movilidad celulares y otras, pero bueno, ahora de alguna manera nos empuja a eso, nos obliga bueno, a sentarnos a conversar, ¿verdad?, entre distintos actores clave, bueno, en cómo establecer reglas claras para acceder a estos datos y cómo compartirlos, y bueno, teniendo en cuenta todos estos elementos que los colegas han mencionado, ¿no? Transparencia, privacidad de la información, protección de datos personales, bueno, notificar, digamos, a los usuarios sobre el uso de sus datos, bueno, todo este tipo de cosas. Yo creo que, bueno, ahora, digamos, se tienen elementos y una experiencia concreta sobre la cual basarnos para empezar a discutir esto y que no sea algo tan hipotético, digamos, que lo podamos bajar bajar a tierra, digamos, al menos en Uruguay, en la región, ¿no? Gracias.
Very much, Federico, for the final comments. Pierre.
Thank you. Well, just building on my previous colleagues' interventions, to respond in terms of what the UN and this panel can look at, two aspects. The first one is we talk about in Canada social beneficial activities as a means to actually, and we're proposing that in new legislative frameworks, as a means for organizations to engage with private organizations to use the data. Again, from an NSO perspective, we already have this for decades in our organization of acquiring data from organizations. And the other one is really very important, I think, that was talked about by Rosita and Federico in trust and transparency, is that ethical framework that we talked about. That ethical framework is very important in Canada, and especially from an NSO perspective. We've implemented a necessity and proportionality framework to look at precisely how to acquire that data and in what case. To me, that's key. And from a public policy perspective, policy and decision makers are actively engaged on that social acceptability and that ethical framework. So again, I would welcome to have a conversation more robust on that, because I see that as supra legislative discussions above data acts and data governance acts and above a regulatory framework that falls secondary in nature. What is those ethical considerations and that public policy debate that we need to have on the acquisition of that data? That's what policymakers and decision makers, at least in my context, are discussing.
Yeah, that is a very, very interesting point. I see that Rosita agrees. But before we go to Rosita, Maria Rosario, some final remarks.
Thank you very much, Martina. I can tell you that the European Commission is more than willing to keep working also with the UN to advance this discussion, because as I tried to convey the message that the B2G provision in the Act are indeed quite limited, and also, but we think it's a good starting point, at least to, we established for the first time in EU legislation that, for example, when there is a public emergency, data has to be shared full stop, and also for free. So it will be very interesting also to try to move this discussion from the European level to the global level. So work in coordination with you, also because in the world we live in, very much interconnected, and also the events, the dramatic events of the last weeks have shown, we need to find ways, collaborative solutions to address global problems, and data is the key. Is day by day, it's more and more important in all the sectors, in all the countries, because data is information, so has to be shared if we want to solve the problem. So we are willing to keep on this discussion, and to also scale it up, because that's what is needed. Thank you.
Yeah, that is indeed. There's a lot of things going on right now that invite for more collaboration. So Rosita, the floor is yours for final words, and then I will close.
Well, echoing everything that was said, I certainly agree on everything related to trust. I'll just build up on that and say that I repeat myself actually from what I said before, but society empowered by data is only when the society is data literate, and you cannot trust anything that you don't understand. So I do think that investment in proper data literacy at the individual, organizational, both public and private sector level is very key. And here also bringing the perspective I've spent the last 5 years in East Africa. And I know that this is a major challenge for us to leverage the data properly and to trust the organizations to use it if we don't understand it, right? Over from my side. And it's been a great conversation. Thank you, Martina, for facilitating it.
Thank you very much to you all. And actually, I hope that we have achieved the objective of this webinar, which was starting from the Data Act to spark a conversation that goes a bit beyond that, around, you know, what does it mean access to privately held data, and what's going on at the global level. So I would like to sincerely thank the panelists who have done an amazing job with a topic that is not super simple to convey and explain sometimes. So thank you very much for the way you presented things very, very clearly. And thank you very much to the participants who asked some very, very good posted questions, both during the registration phase and now in live. I just want to invite you to stay tuned. There are going to be other webinars from this series. So if you want to participate in the upcoming webinars, follow the website of the UN Statistical Division and the Twitter for the most up-to-date information. I think our colleagues posted the Twitter handle, which is UN Data Forum. And yeah, it was really a great pleasure for me to moderate this conversation today. And thank you very much to everybody who joined. We'll be speaking soon, and probably there will be more conversation on this topic very soon. Thank you very much.